Happy East Creek has been possessed by a demon. Since Eileen's horrible death a fortnight past, the creek has been polluted by a foul oil and an abundance of strange totems. Mary Johnson, 1825.
There was an incident that occurred involving a young child by the name of Eileen Trakel. This little girl was playing in a very shallow stream of water and she drowned.
Now, the creek was real shallow. It was only probably 6 to 8 inches deep. A child could just wade across or crawl across there, really. It was so shallow.
Well, supposedly, according to the story, there was 12 witnesses who observed a ghostly white hand come up out of the water and drag the child under the water.
That's all they could see. Nobody ever saw a face or a body. All they remember seeing was the arm and the hand. And before they could get to her, she had pulled her down. She'd went under the rocks and the mud, and everything was calm again.
But I have a problem with this story. How is it that 11 people happen to be in the right place at the same time to simultaneously see this ghostly hand come up and drag this child under the water?
The river is searched. Now, unfortunately, you're talking about knee-deep water. It's only 2 or 3 feet at the maximum. Her body should have easily been found. It's never found.
I think that in the case of the Eileen Trakel story is that there's another explanation, that perhaps it was something like parental neglect. Someone wasn't watching the child and the child drowned.
For the first time in recorded history, a death is blamed on the Blair Witch. The news of it spreads as far as Baltimore, sparking this reaction.
Dear Sir, I find myself forced to write this letter upon the atrocity that I found within your pages this Sunday past. I have never seen such callousness shown towards the death of a young child, especially one who was taken from this world in such a terrible manner. As to your humorous view of the beliefs of her parents that she was murdered by a ghost, I remind you that there have been many reports of such terrible spectres witnessed in the nearby townships. Whether or not these wild tales are true is incidental. The fact remains that a young girl has tragically drowned, and her memory should not be tarnished by such wild and torrid speculation over the manner of her death. Sincerely, Eugene Robertson.
The river, according to what we've been told through written records, then turns oily and has a bunch of stick figures floating into it for the next week. No one can use the river for any kind of water for food or drinking or anything like that. It's totally unusable.
After that, the people wouldn't even go near the creek. They wouldn't fish in it, they didn't swim in it, they didn't do anything in it because it just scared them completely to death, and they blamed that on the Blair Witch.
May 15th, 1829. Delivered twin calves this morning. I'm moving the entire herd to the fallow pasture because 3 cattle died from drinking creek water. I'm using the pond instead. Lloyd Wellens, Farming Journal.
And the town again kind of returned to normal one more time.
They went into the woods prepared to find death. What they found was a desecration of humanity at the site which trappers have often referred to as Coffin Rock. On top of the rock formation,
There was a lady lived there in town when I was a boy. She was 50 years old when I knew her. And she told me that when she was a little girl, she had been walking in the woods one day and this lady appeared to her. And she wasn't walking, she was floating in the air really, and took her by the hand and led her to an old house back in the woods and took her down in the basement and left her there and said she'd be back. And she left. And the little girl sat there, she said, for several hours, and finally she got scared. She ran, able to crawl through a window and ran back to town. But in the meantime, the town had started to search for her. They sent out a search party to look for her in the woods.
But it's plausible here that this little girl was only telling a story of the Blair Witch as she heard it from maybe her parents her siblings, or her friends. But what is strange about this case was that the first search party that had gone out to look for the little girl had vanished.
When the entire search party failed to return, another search party was dispatched to find them. What they found was a massacre.
And that search party come up on Coffin Hill or Coffin Rock and found those men.
The first search party had been killed, laid out on a flat rock in the woods. They had been disemboweled, and on their faces, their hands and feet were carved these strange pagan symbols.
And they were heavily cut in by the rope, so they were alive when they were tied up. And somebody had disemboweled every one of them and cut some letters and stuff in their foreheads. And very good. It wasn't crude. You could read whatever was there. It was all symbolic type stuff. And it scared them very bad, and like most it would anybody. Like I couldn't have stood there very long.
Their bodies were in a severe state of decomposition. So the search party goes back to get help, and when they return, the bodies have vanished without a trace.
But they could still smell death in the air, which where men die or women die, that you can always smell that. And there was no sign of them there. Now,
if you notice, there's been an interval of about 60 years in between these events, and if we move forward to 1940, which is about 60 years, we find another interesting situation that happens in this very same area.
There are an unusually high number of children laid to rest here, most of whom passed in the 1940s. Yet no one in the town seems to recall anything unusual about this time. To us, anyway. Yet legend tells a different story. One whose evidence is all around us, etched in stone.
I remember Mr. Parr was an old hermit.
Right.
And he lived up on the mountain. He had a place up there, been there for a long, long time. Sort of in the winter, I guess, the fall or the winter 1940, some of the young kids started to disappear, and nobody knew anything about why they were disappearing. Finally, one day, old Mr. Parr come down into the market and said, "I'm finally finished."
And what did he mean by that?
Well, I guess nobody knew at first, but the police finally went up on the mountain, and they searched his house, and they found the bodies of 7 kids from the area.
Wow.
And those were the 7 kids that were missing, and then they brought them out of the woods one at a time, and it just was a terrible thing. It just tore the whole community up.
Each of them had again been disemboweled. There was again reported strange markings of carvings on their hands, on their foreheads, ritualistic carvings, if you will.
Well, Rustin Parr admitted to this crime, and in the court he said that the reason he killed the children is that he was doing what this old lady ghost had told him to do. Now, it's possible that this man was trying to fit himself into the mythos of the Blair Witch. But that's conjecture.
One child, Kyle Brody, would escape from Parr's clutches. He was able to give testimony, and it was his words that decided the fate of the Burkittsville killer.